My father looked at me across that boardroom table and said, "She has no standing here. She's a courtesy copy on an old email chain, nothing more." His lawyer nodded. My stepmother touched my father's arm and smiled at the mediator the way people smile when they think they've already won. I didn't say anything. I just sat there with my hands flat on the table looking at the window behind them. It was November in Halifax, and the harbor was gray and completely still. I had driven 11 hours to be in that room. 11 hours from Thunder Bay, where I'd been working as a structural engineer for a firm that contracted with the province. I'd taken 3 days of personal leave. I'd ironed my one good blazer in a motel bathroom in Sudbury at 6 in the morning. And my father looked at me and called me a courtesy copy. Let me go back. Because none of this makes sense without going back. My mother was 24 when she had me. She was a nurse. Not in a hospital, she worked in home care, going door to door in the Dartmouth area, with a bag full of wound dressings and blood pressure cuffs and more patients than anyone I've ever known. She and my father were married for 6 years. I don't remember much of the marriage, just fragments. A kitchen that smelled like cardamom, my father's work boots by the door. A phone ringing late at night, and the way my mother's voice got very quiet when she answered it. They divorced when I was 4. My mother never spoke badly about him. Not once. She would say, "Your father is complicated," and then she would change the subject, ask me about school or whether I wanted hot chocolate. I used to think that was generous of her. Now I think it was something harder than generosity. I think she'd already accepted something I wouldn't understand for another 30 years. After the divorce, my father remarried within 18 months. His new wife had 2 children from her first marriage, a boy and a girl, a little older than me. They moved into a house in Bedford, nice neighborhood, close to the good schools. I know this because my mother drove me past it once when I was 8. She didn't say anything. She just slowed down for a moment and then drove on. My father and I had a relationship that I can only describe as scheduled. He picked me up every other weekend until I was 12, and then the weekends became lunches, and then the lunches became birthday cards, and then the birthday cards stopped coming on time, and then they stopped coming at all. By the time I was 16, we communicated primarily through my mother, who communicated primarily through silence. I stopped expecting anything from him when I was 17. That wasn't bitterness, not exactly. It was more like putting down a bag you've been carrying for so long, your shoulders have changed shape around it, you don't even feel lighter. You just notice, one day, that your hands are free. My mother, meanwhile, built something. It wasn't loud or dramatic. She worked, she saved, she bought a small house in Dartmouth in the early 90s when prices were low and people thought she was making a mistake. She paid it off in 12 years. She took a second job on weekends for 4 of those years so she could also open a registered education savings plan for me. When I got into engineering at Dal, she sat at the kitchen table and cried in a way I'd never seen her cry before. Not sad, just overcome, like something that had been pressing on her chest had finally let go. I graduated in 2014. I worked in Halifax for 3 years, then took a position in Ontario. My mother visited me in Thunder Bay twice. She hated the winters, said they had a different quality of cold than the East Coast, more serious somehow. But she came. She always came. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2019. Stage 3. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me with the same voice she used to tell me the grocery store was out of the cereal I liked. "It's not great news," she said, "but I'm not going anywhere fast." She was right for a while. She did 2 rounds of chemotherapy, responded reasonably well, had a year where things felt almost normal. Then 2021 came, and her numbers changed, and the oncologist used different words. I moved back to Nova Scotia in January of 2022. I worked remotely for 8 months. I drove her to appointments. I learned how to manage a palliative care schedule, how to talk to pharmacists about medication interactions, how to sit in a room with someone who is dying and not make it about your own fear. She died in September of 2022 on a Wednesday morning with me in the room. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn 2 streets over. I remember thinking that was such a strange thing to hear. What I did not know sitting in that hospital room was that my mother had been planning for years, The house in Dartmouth had appreciated significantly. This is Halifax real estate, and even modest homes in Dartmouth had tripled in value since the 90s. She also had a whole life insurance policy she'd kept paying into since before I was born, a small but consistent investment account through her credit union, and the RRSP she'd been building since her 40s. She had written a will in 2017, updated it in 2021, and named me as the sole beneficiary of her estate. She had also, with the help of her lawyer, set up a formal testamentary trust to protect a portion of the assets until final probate was complete. Her estate lawyer was a woman named Bridget, a small, precise woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and who called me the week after my mother died to explain what would happen next. "This will be straightforward," Bridget said, "as long as no one challenges it." I remember thinking, who would challenge it? I found out in December. My father's lawyer sent a letter to Bridget's office. I'm still not entirely sure what my father thought he had standing to claim. They had been divorced for 30 years, there was a formal separation agreement, and my mother had remarried briefly in the late 90s before that marriage also ended. But apparently my father and his wife had convinced themselves, through some logic I have never fully followed, that because my mother had listed my father in some capacity on an old insurance document from the mid-90s, a document that had long since been superseded, they had grounds to contest the distribution of the estate. It was not a real legal claim. Bridget was very clear about that, but it was a claim that required a formal response, and that response required a hearing, and that hearing was what brought me to that boardroom in Halifax in November of 2022. I had not seen my father in 9 years. Not since a chance encounter at a Tim Hortons on Barrington Street, where we'd stood in line next to each other for a moment before he looked away and I let him. That was 2013. I don't know if he recognized me. I've always assumed he did. The hearing was not in a courtroom. It was a preliminary mediation session, one of those things that's supposed to keep everything out of court. There was a mediator, a calm man who kept refilling the water glasses. There was Bridget on my side of the table. There was my father's lawyer, a man who spoke quickly and confidently in the way that people do when they've decided their argument is stronger than it is. There was my stepmother, who had apparently become very interested in my mother's estate now that my mother was dead. And there was my father. He was older than I remembered, more deliberate in his movements. He had the look of a man who had spent decades being told he was right by people around him and who had stopped questioning it. He didn't look at me when I came in. Or rather, he looked through me, which is different. The session began formally enough. The mediator explained the process. My father's lawyer presented their position, which, stripped of its language, amounted to, this woman should not receive what her mother left her, because we would prefer she didn't. Bridget responded with the actual legal record, the divorce decree, the separation agreement, the updated insurance documents, the 2010 will, notarized, witnessed, filed, the 2021 amendment, the clear chain of designation. My father's lawyer kept circling back to the original insurance document from 1994. It was like watching someone insist a map from 30 years ago was more accurate than the road they were standing on. And then my father said it. The mediator had asked, quietly, whether there was any dispute about the identity of the petitioner, meaning me, meaning whether I was who I said I was in relation to my mother's estate. My father's lawyer said there was no dispute about identity, but there was a question of standing. And my father leaned forward slightly and said, "She's a courtesy copy on an old email chain. She has no real standing here. She's not a material party to this estate." I looked at my hands on the table. The harbor was gray behind him, and Bridget, my mother's lawyer, the small woman with the reading glasses on a beaded chain, set down her pen very deliberately, the way my mother used to set down her coffee mug when she was about to say something she'd thought about carefully. "With respect," Bridget said, directing her words to the mediator, "I'd like to ask clarifying questions directly." The mediator nodded. Bridget looked at my father's lawyer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her expression. "Your client has stated that the petitioner has no standing as a material party to this estate. Can your client confirm for the record, is he disputing that the petitioner is the biological daughter of the deceased?" My father's lawyer started to answer quickly, The way he'd been doing everything? Bridget held up one finger. "I'd like the answer from your client directly, please, for the record." There was a pause. The mediator looked at my father. My father said no. He wasn't disputing that. "And is your client disputing that the deceased had the legal right to designate her biological daughter as sole beneficiary of her estate, having been divorced from your client for over 30 years, with a signed separation agreement on file?" Another pause. Longer. "No," my father's lawyer said, more carefully this time. "Then," Bridget said, "I'm not certain what we are here to discuss. The petitioner is the sole named beneficiary of a valid will. She is the biological daughter of the deceased. The 1994 document your client has referenced was superseded in 1998, which is in the file you received last month. There is no legal mechanism by which your client can contest the distribution of assets from his former spouse's estate, which was accumulated independently over 30 years following their divorce." She picked her pen back up. "I am happy to continue this session," she said, "but I want to be clear that we are discussing a matter with no legal basis for dispute, and continued proceedings will result in costs that fall to the contesting party." The mediator cleared his throat. My father said nothing. His lawyer said something quietly to him. My stepmother, who had been nodding throughout the whole session up to this point, had stopped nodding. I looked at my father for the first time since sitting down. His face had a particular quality to it, not quite pale, not quite shocked, but something between those two things, like a man who has walked into a room and discovered it is not the room he thought it was. He didn't look at me. The session ended 40 minutes later. No challenge to the estate would proceed. The mediator noted the decision. Bridget gathered her folders with the same efficiency with which she had opened them. In the hallway afterward, I put on my coat. Bridget stood beside me and said, "Your mother chose her lawyer well. She had every document in order, every single one." I thought about that for a moment. My mother, driving to appointments in her little Honda, carrying her nursing bag through Dartmouth in the rain, making calls on her lunch break, sitting with a lawyer in 2017, and then again in 2021, making sure that what she built would reach me without interruption. "She was always like that," I said. "She always thought ahead." I drove back to my motel. I sat on the edge of the bed and called my aunt, my mother's younger sister, who still lives in Truro. She picked up on the second ring. "How'd it go?" she asked. "It's done," I said. She was quiet for a second. Then, "She would be so proud of you." I thought about that. About my mother sitting at the kitchen table in 2014, crying when I told her I'd gotten the job in Halifax. About the house in Dartmouth that she'd paid off herself, slowly, over 12 years. About the way she'd said, "Your father is complicated," and then changed the subject. Every single time for 30 years. She had never asked me to fight. She had never told me to be angry. She had just made sure, quietly, precisely, the way she did everything, that when the time came, the truth would stand on its own. It did. The estate closed in February of 2023. I transferred back to a firm in Halifax that spring. I drive past that house in Dartmouth sometimes on my way to work. It has new window trim now, and someone planted hedges along the front, but the bones of it are the same. The same house she picked, on her own, with her own money, when everyone told her to wait. I never heard from my father again after that day in the boardroom. I don't expect to. Some doors close not with a fight, but with a document, filed, notarized final, and with a small woman in reading glasses who sets down her pen and says calmly that she's happy to continue, but perhaps we should first discuss whether there is anything left to discuss. There wasn't. There never had been. I keep coming back to one image. My mother, sitting at a kitchen table in Dartmouth, going over documents with a lawyer she'd found on her own, paying for that appointment out of the same careful budget she used for everything else in her life. She wasn't doing it out of anger. She wasn't doing it to win anything. She just understood something I was still learning, that the people who love you most don't always protect you with words. Sometimes they protect you with paperwork, filed correctly, years in advance, before anyone even knows there's something to protect. What happened in that boardroom didn't happen because I was clever or well-connected, or because I fought back hard enough. It happened because my mother was honest about what she built and who she built it for, and because she had the clear-headedness to make sure that honesty was documented and airtight long before anyone could dispute it. That's its own kind of wisdom. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that shows up in the moment, but the slow, quiet intelligence of someone who looks ahead and does the unglamorous work of preparation when nobody is watching. My father walked into that room believing that confidence was the same as correctness. His lawyer spoke quickly. My stepmother nodded at all the right moments. They had assembled the posture of people who expected to win, and I think they had mistaken that posture for an actual argument. What they didn't have was the truth on their side, and no amount of boardroom composure can substitute for that over the long run. The documents Bridget laid out didn't need to be argued. They just needed to be read. I think about the choices my mother made over 30 years. The second job on weekends, the credit union meetings, the will she updated in 2021 when she already knew things were getting harder. She never asked anyone's permission to build something. She never waited for circumstances to become easier. She just kept going, with the kind of persistence that doesn't announce itself because it's too busy being consistent. That persistence was the through line of her life, and it turns out it was also the strongest thing she ever left me. What I try to carry forward from all of this is simpler than it sounds. Do what's right, even when it's inconvenient and nobody is watching. Think carefully about the future and make decisions that will hold up under pressure. And when things are hard, genuinely hard, the kind of hard where you're ironing a blazer in a motel bathroom in Sudbury at 6 a.m, keep going anyway, because the people who loved you already did the harder work of making sure the ground beneath you was solid. Bridget said my mother had every document in order. Every single one. That wasn't luck. That was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and who decided, quietly, that I was worth doing it for.